Angelo Bronte stands between us and our future.
You'll damn us all.
Hosea Matthews, trusted assistant to Dutch Van Der Linde. Where Dutch is always seen as a charismatic and charming leader, Hosea was the realistic voice of reason, always cautious, always putting others' care and needs before anything else, before anyone else. Whenever Dutch had an idea, it was never acted upon until it was ran through the filter of Hosea. While the relationship between these two seems to have always been one of mutual love and respect, here in this moment, there's a rift between the two of them.
We need to put him out of commission.
I disagree. There's always an easier way.
There ain't no easier way. Now, I know his type. He is a vindictive little power broker who rules by fear. Now, we pull that stunt in his cesspit of a town, we're doomed.
Arthur, if it's business, well, business is business.
Angelo Bronte stands between us and our future.
You'll damn us all.
Dutch, with Arthur's backing, may have just decided on going through with a plan that may have indirectly fueled the course of events that will ultimately lead down the path of chaos, destruction, and death of many people. One such person who would have to pay with his life is Hosea himself. It may be difficult to precisely say how things would have transpired differently had Hosea lived. Similar to the theory and the questions posed of what would have happened if Arthur never contracted tuberculosis? Or, if he still did, what would be the outcome if the sickness was slowed and he found himself in better health during the events of Beaver Hollow? Today, we're going to be tackling two questions. The first one, of course, is what would have happened if Hosea had lived until the dying days of the Van Der Linde gang? The second, though somewhat closely related question, is how much differently would the robbery of the Saint-Denis Bank have gone down if Dutch and Arthur heeded Hosea's warning here and decided to just leave Angelo Bronte alone? Let's begin with that question right there. While there's no evidence that the raid on Angelo Bronte's mansion and subsequent death had no direct impact on the events of the bank robbery on the surface, one could easily put together it set into motion a series of events that put the Van Der Linde gang under a bigger microscope than they needed to be. In a previous video, we already touched on how powerful of a man Angelo Bronte was, even if we just talked about it briefly. Bronte's sudden disappearance and obvious murder, given the absolute bloodbath left behind in his mansion, would have put many law enforcement officers on high alert, least of all the Pinkertons, who had been closely gaining in on the Van Der Linde gang. Twice now, Agent Milton and Ross had appeared close by and even inside the Van Der Linde camp, an unwelcomed arrival that definitely contributed to the Van Der Linde gang relocating up in Shady Belle. With the Van Der Linde gang's trail turning cold, yet aware that there's still, within the general area, events such as a failed trolley station robbery, a shootout on the ferry boat in the harbor of Saint-Denis, and finally the massacre of Bronte's estate would clearly point the Pinkertons in the right direction Dutch was moving in. Given Bronte is known to have the local law in his own pockets and, seen in the epilogue mission, bare-knuckle friendships, the city and all those immediately under Bronte's control still felt his absence. An absence that definitely led to an increased awareness within the city of Dutch and the gang's movements. While there's no glaringly obvious evidence on the Pinkertons contacting Angelo Bronte directly or even trying to communicate with Bronte's men or law enforcement within the city to get an idea of where the Van Der Linde gang is, we can assume to some degree Bronte's position and relationship with the Pinkertons. Seeing Bronte's sense of superiority over the Van Der Linde gang, the politicians that on the outside actually run the city of Saint-Denis, such as the mayor, or even the outcasts, like that of the Indians. No one is allowed to conduct any type of business within this city without his knowledge or blessing. I believe this feeling would be the same towards even the Pinkertons, especially if Bronte saw use of the Van Der Linde gang, which he did, as during the mission, The Gilded Cage, Bronte suggests having Dutch kill people for him in the future.
That is Hector Fellows, this self-righteous newspaper man. Maybe you will kill him for me one day.
With Bronte running the city, whether if he's seen a usefulness to be had out of the Van Der Linde gang or not, the bottom line here is due to his heightened sense of superiority and the fact law enforcement along with his heavily armed bodyguards were all under his control, there would be no need for the Pinkertons' help to be sought out with neutralizing the threat that is the Van Der Linde gang. Why would Bronte need any sort of help dealing with some inbred backwards country folk? After all, it was because of him that Dutch and his members are even still breathing within his city. When we look at it from this perspective, it's almost as if Bronte is actually the buffer Dutch needed from the Pinkertons. There is no need for the Pinkertons to come guns blazing into the city that's already under control by local official law enforcement that's further supported by Bronte's personal militia. If the Pinkertons were to do that, then they run the risk of pissing off Bronte, and by pissing off Bronte, they run the risk of the Pinkertons and Bronte's men, backed up by local law enforcement, engaging in an all-out war. A war that would be perfect for Dutch to escape in the background of. Better than for the Pinkertons to just continue to patrol the local area on the outskirts of Saint Denis, defend Leviticus Cornwall's property while keeping a keen ear on any kind of reports indicating the Van Der Linde gang's presence within the area. Within this context, by Dutch and Arthur ignoring Hosea's plight to just leave Angelo Bronte alone, the insult of being tricked into robbing an empty trolley station was, by Hosea's standards, an insult that can be easily forgiven, as Bronte is not only too powerful, but Dutch is also taking the insult way too personally, putting everyone at risk. I believe if Dutch and Arthur listened to Hosea and allowed Bronte to be as is, Bronte would have acted one of two ways. Either he was fearful of a possible effort of retaliation by the Van Der Linde gang, which in turn would lead him to doubling his personal security at his mansion, or, aware of Dutch's survival through the failed trolley robbery and his intentions to acquire as much cash as possible to move on, would have doubled the amount of police presence around the bank, hopefully as a deterrent. Considering there was no heightened security at Bronte's house though, when Dutch did finally seek his revenge, we can say the first option really isn't possible. I was thinking maybe the security here just wasn't heightened because Bronte hadn't yet heard Dutch was still alive, but I find that very unlikely given how tight of a hold this man has on the city. Someone had to have already informed him of Dutch's survival. He has to be aware that Dutch is still alive. With that being the case, a lack of increased security would just prove to be another sign of this man's arrogance and firm belief that he really is untouchable. And even if he did heighten the security surrounding the Saint Denis Bank, well, it would have been a little bit more difficult, and the Van Der Linde gang's approach to actually taking on this bank probably would have been altered significantly. I think even if the plans changed drastically, there still wasn't a chance of Hosea being captured. However, with the disappearance of Bronte, the floodgates were now lifted, and the Pinkertons, all too aware of how the Van Der Linde gang collectively and individually operated, saw a chance to snatch a sole member who was tasked with the role of a distraction. It was just by pure dumb luck that this sole member was Dutch's voice of reason. I think it was due to Bronte being gone and the gang's heightened sense of being untouchable, a feeling undoubtedly given after the murder of the most powerful man within the city was carried out with almost no repercussions whatsoever, that put the gang in this vulnerable position. If Bronte had been allowed to live, I believe Hosea would have also lived, which is an interesting way to really think about the relationship between Dutch, Bronte, and the impact that it ultimately had on the robbery of the Bank of Saint Denis. I think this had one of the most detrimental repercussions possible that no one ultimately saw coming, if those ties between the Pinkertons and Bronte can really be believed to be in this context. Now, if Hosea was to see the end of the Van Der Linde gang, what would he see and what role would he take up? Truthfully, I don't think he would take any other role besides one that sounds a little bit disappointing for the most of us. While I believe there isn't a shadow of a doubt that if Hosea had been allowed to live and he's seen the events of Beaver Hollow really unfold, I think Arthur would have had one of the strongest support systems that he really badly needed during this chapter. Hosea still would have been his counsel. Hosea still would have been that voice of reason. And trying to hold Dutch accountable while also keeping the gang together wouldn't have fell firmly on Arthur's shoulders as much as it feels like it does in the actual game. But as I was saying, I think Hosea would still take a little bit of a disappointing stance, because if we take a step back and look at how his interactions with Dutch became as the game progresses, Dutch, whether if we want to attribute this to Micah or not, slowly started to do as he pleased, pushing Hosea to the wayside. As early as a robbery in Leviticus Cornwall's train during the chapter of Coulter, Hosea is already against this idea. He just wants to lay low, he just wants to get out of the mountains, and he still wants to ensure everybody is safe and isn't constantly moving from point A to point B with the Pinkertons hot on their tail. Dutch, however, obviously feels strongly against this. Even from this early moment in the game, Dutch mentions on their way to Horseshoe Overlook that Arthur and Hosea can reminisce on the good old days and discuss how Dutch has lost his mind. If Hosea had lived during the dying days of the gang, I think this is exactly how it would have played out. Hosea, now more than ever, would be hell-bent on saving as many people as he could, saving them from the burning ship that Dutch was now the captain of. If Hosea didn't jump ship and leave on his own volition as so many others did, I think he and Arthur in a twisted way would still be very loyal and devoted to Dutch. He may be psychotic madman leading them all down to ruin, yet he's still their loved companion and father. I believe they would try to reason with him as Arthur tried to reason with him during the events of the actual game. Considering Hosea is more of a pacifist versus Dutch, I don't think Hosea would have been as aggressive with it. I do think there would have been a strong possibility of a type of civil war erupting where instead of it being Arthur and John versus Dutch, Micah, and the rest of the gang members, it definitely would have been Arthur, John, and Hosea. It would just now depend on how many people actually respected and backed up Hosea versus Dutch. But I'm gonna pass this question on to you. What do you think about this theory? Do you think it's feasible? Do you think it would have been highly unlikely and there's something else that you to actually be the case? Let me know down in the comment section below. And of course, like always, if you have any theories, character analysis, or anything like that that you want to have us to jump into within these next videos, by all means, please feel free to share that down in the comment section below. But until then, thank you so much for watching.